She was rejected by everyone, called the old doll. But today the dress she was made to hide is worth millions. And no one expected who would appear in that parade. She was left as if forgetting something worthless. Wrapped in a grimy blanket, her face hidden among the lint, no one knew who left her there. Just a note attached to the blanket. Take care of it. It was dawn. The wind cut through the skin, and the gate of the orphanage creaked, not out of pity, but out of custom. When they found the girl, she was awake. The big eyes didn't cry. They just watched, as if they understood too soon that the world is not willing to explain anything. Leah was 6 years old and had no last name, no past told, no souvenir delivered. He entered the orphanage as a light shadow, one of those that pass by and no one notices, but little by little it became a presence, although not in the way I expected. The other children soon realized that there was something different about her. While some received donations of new clothes or toys from charitable families, Leah earned what was left, and sometimes not even that. He wore short pants, leaky t-shirts, and shoes that creaked more than the gates. At first, I accepted it in silence. Then he tried to adapt. He collected pieces of cloth forgotten in the courtyard, remnants of curtains from the warehouse, old dish towels, and with small but restless hands she began to sew, first for you, then to her makeshift dolls with old socks and bottle caps. The clothes he created were not ordinary. They were colorful, full of patches, but with a care that could not be explained. The points were crooked, but they were there by choice, as if each mistake also had a right place. However, what for her was beauty, for others it was a reason for laughter. She came to be called an old doll. They laughed at their hand-sewn clothes, the fabrics that didn't match, the apparent threads, the mismatched colors. They pointed, mocked, pushed. Look there, the seamstress of the garbage. Leah listened. He always listened. But he never answered. I just lowered my eyes and moved on. The pain hurt more inside, where no one could see. What no one knew was that, when everyone was asleep, she would go to the back of the courtyard. There was a broken window and a cracked mirror attached to the wall, forgotten. It was on this piece of glass that Leah looked at herself. She put on her patched clothes, carefully adjusted the loose threads, and observed her own reflection as if she saw a queen. Not just any queen, one of those who sport jewels and golden dresses. She was a patchwork queen, a girl who created beauty from what others threw away. There, alone in front of that broken mirror, Leah smiled, even with his face marked by the tears of hours before, because in that piece of silence she felt whole, as if each seam in the clothes was also a seam in the soul. Something inside her said that it mattered, that those cloths, however despised, could still be beautiful. And maybe, just maybe, she could too. There was no one to praise her nor to encourage her. Everything he did without an audience, without applause, without recognition. But there was a hunger inside her. Not just food, though that was also constant, but something she didn't know how to name. It was a desire to show, to express, to transform everything I felt into something visible. And the fabrics were his voice, while the other children slept. Clinging to stuffed animals, Leah slept with pieces of cloth sewn in a hurry. When I woke up, I looked for more leftovers, more lines, more opportunities to create. He began to put away everything he could find: crumpled gift ribbons, torn labels, pieces of zipper, lost buttons. No child fought with her about it. No one wanted that garbage, but Leah wanted to. Because he knew that together all those remains told a story, and without even realizing it, she was writing hers. Each point was a memory, each patch a scar that she transformed into art, not with words, with needle and thread. It was impossible to predict what would come next, but something was already being sown inside her. A silent vocation, born in abandonment, nourished by pain, cultivated in solitude. And even though the world was still laughing, Leah was beginning deep down to believe that her scraps could be worth more than gold. If you're already feeling your heart tighten with this story, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. And tell me here in the comments, which city are you watching from? The orphanage rather than shelter. was a silent arena where each day required resistance. There were rules, schedules, obligations, but nothing was more difficult than dealing with the gaze of others. The children, carrying their own traumas, found in mockery a way to escape their own pain. And Leah, with her made-up and colorful clothes, was the perfect target. While some girls showed off dresses donated by charities, she paraded in skirts made of dishcloth and blouses of fabric printed with faded flowers. Comments were inevitable. They called her a scarecrow, an old doll, a seamstress of garbage. Some boys tore ribbons from the pieces she sewed so carefully, only to laugh as she, embarrassed, picked them up from the floor and put them in their pockets. Others pointed to their shoes, too old, too pierced, and laughed even more when they realized that Leah glued pieces of electrical tape to the ends, not to repair, but to decorate. Mockery was routine. No one protected her. The caregivers thought it was child's play, and Leah never complained. He had learned early on that the more he cried, the stronger the attack would be the next day. That's why she was silent. He swallowed everything. But there was a ritual that he kept secret. A moment of her own, in the late afternoon, when the other children went to play or rest. Leah walked to the back of the orphanage where no one used to go. There was an old mirror, cracked in several parts, hanging crookedly on the wall behind the laundry room. The glass was dusty, cracked, covered with marks of time. And yet, it was there that Leah saw herself whole. Every time he finished a new piece, he would run to that mirror, put on what he had created with his own hands, and look at himself in silence. There was something in that reflection that no one else saw. Even with the flaws, the loose threads, the fabrics of colors that didn't match, she saw beauty. And for a few seconds he smiled. It was a light, shy smile, but deeply true. A smile that didn't ask for anyone's approval. She saw herself differently. Maybe stronger, maybe freer. There was no luxury, no brilliance, no perfection. But there was intention. Leah knew she sewed more than clothes. She sewed self-esteem. It was there, in that secret ritual, that he mended his own feelings. Each piece was made as if it spoke for her, not with words, but with shapes and colors. And when she looked, in the mirror, what she saw was not the laughter of the other children, but a version of herself that did not yet exist in the world, but that she already believed to be real. Over time, his small handmade wardrobe grew. She kept the pieces in a cardboard box hidden under the bed, along with scraps, colored thread, crooked needles, and lost buttons. Leah was careful, meticulous, almost obsessive. Even though he had never learned how to cut or sew, he seemed to know the way of the needle with instinct. His creativity did not follow the pattern. He sewed the way he felt. Some pieces had uneven sleeves, others had crooked hems, and yet there was something about them that caught the eye, even if it was just hers. She also started drawing. He found used pieces of paper and scratched out shapes for dresses and sets. She did this at night, lying in the dark, with the pencil she hid from one of the boxes in the classroom. It was in these drawings that he imagined what it would be like if he could sew without fear. What it would be like to wear what you felt inside without hiding from the eyes of others. He often slept with the pencil still in his hand and his fingers dirty with graphite. That broken mirror, dirty and ignored by others, was more than a reflection. It was the only place where she saw herself as she really wanted to be, where he allowed himself to dream, even without knowing what hope was. Sometimes she would stand there for minutes, watching the details, spinning to see how the fabric fell, adjusting a sleeve, holding the hem, smiling to herself. It was as if, on that small, improvised stage, she really existed. And it was in this same space that, for the first time, a question arose within her that would change everything. What if one day someone saw what I see? It was not ambition. It was a desire to belong. She wanted the world, or at least one person, to look at her clothes the same way she did. I wanted to be understood, not admired. She wanted that quiet beauty to be recognized as real, not a lonely girl's fantasy. But when she left there and returned to the other children, reality overwhelmed her again. The comments came back. The laughter, the pushes, the looks of contempt. Leah did not defend herself, not because he didn't want to, but because he knew no one would listen. The only thing she could do was keep creating. Keep sewing. It was the only answer he knew. And deep down, although she didn't tell anyone, she knew that her hands were saying everything that her mouth couldn't express. Time passed, and the other children were adopted, transferred, taken. Leah stayed. It was the one that no one chose. The one who did not receive gifts. The one who didn't smile in the collective photos. But as the world forgot about her, she learned to remember herself, and that made all the difference. His name was barely pronounced by the officials. It only appeared in spreadsheets or routine calls, and yet in silence, she sewed a piece of her own destiny every day. She was aware that the world was not kind, but she did not let that stop her from continuing to create beauty, even if it was just for herself. It was as if each stitch on the line was also a seam in his story, a piece of identity being rebuilt. And although no one knew it yet, Leah was about to turn her scraps into something much bigger than the orphanage could have imagined. That cracked mirror was still there, reflecting a girl who, in the eyes of all, was invisible. But for herself, she was beginning to take shape. And while everyone continued to laugh, something inside her was beginning to change. It was on any given morning, one of those that seemed to be born the same, that Leah found the box. She was standing in front of the orphanage's side gate, left next to the garbage, wet with dew, and surrounded by lazy flies. But something about that box drew attention. When she approached, she saw that it was not ordinary garbage. They were fabrics, real fabrics, colorful, printed, folded with care, still smelling of fresh paint and tailor's chalk. They must have come from some cutting and sewing school in the city. Scraps that were no longer useful to those who used them to teach, but that, for Leah, looked like pieces of a secret treasure. She didn't hesitate. He waited until no one was around, pulled the box with effort, and dragged it behind the orphanage, where he kept his few materials. His heart was beating fast. It was as if someone, even without knowing it, had given her a gift. She opened the layers of fabric like someone who opens the pages of a book. There were florals, stripes, pastel tones, and pieces of tulle. He had never had access to fabrics like this. It was as if he had finally found new words to write his story. He knew exactly what he was going to do with them. I had been imagining a dress for a long time, a real dress, not made from badly sewn pieces or adapted floor cloths, but something whole, with form, intention, lightness, and above all, beauty. He spent days hiding the fabrics. He sewed at night, using a needle he had found months earlier and which he treasured. I didn't have enough lines, so I combined different tones, creating curious contrasts. She sewed with long and crooked stitches, not because of aesthetic choice, but because of lack of technique. And yet there was delicacy in every detail. The dress was taking shape. It was light blue with sleeves made of a greenish transparent fabric. The bottom was round, made of a thicker cotton, dyed with diluted ink from markers she found thrown in the reading room. She added old buttons left over from a donated shirt, and in the center applied a small felt flower that she designed and cut out herself. Leah didn't know if the dress was beautiful by the standards of the world, but to her it was the most beautiful thing she had ever done. Each night she would place it in front of the cracked mirror and spin, watching the movement of the fabric, the details, the faint sound it made when it touched the cement floor. It was the dress of her dreams. And that month, the orphanage announced that there would be a celebration party due to a visit from donors. It would be the first formal party they would have in a long time. The children would be given clean clothes and could perform. Most were excited by the idea of gaining attention and maybe even gifts. But Leah only thought about one thing, wearing her dress. He guarded it even more zealously. She folded it carefully, wrapped it in a piece of old sheet and hid it in the back of the laundry closet where no one touched. For days, she rehearsed the moment when she would walk through the courtyard with him. I imagined that maybe, just this once, they wouldn't mock. Perhaps just this once, someone would notice something beyond the appearance of the fabrics. Maybe someone saw effort, beauty, art. The day of the feast arrived. The children ran through the orphanage, excited about the clothes they received. Colorful dresses, starched shirts, shoes that smelled new. Leah arrived later alone with her dress neatly folded in her arms. She went to the back bathroom, dressed quietly, straightened her hair as best she could, and looked at herself one last time in the cracked mirror. This was the moment he had waited for so long. She was nervous, but determined. When he entered the main room, everything stopped for a second. A brief silence was followed by whispers. Someone, out loud, let out the first laugh. He said she looked like a thrift store rug. Another child commented that the dress looked like it came out of the trash. And then the laughter spread like wildfire. Leah stopped halfway. The dress she loved so much now seemed to weigh tons on her body. Words cut more than any needle. Someone even pulled the hem of her skirt. And the sound she heard next was a pop, the fabric tearing. A piece of the dress fell to the floor. She didn't say anything. He did not react. He just turned around and ran away. He hid in the bathroom and locked the door. The tears came before she could even breathe. He cried with his face in his hands, trying to muffle the sound so as not to give any more reasons for laughter. The dress was torn, dirty, stained with dust and derision. It was the same dress she thought would make her scene. That would be her chance to be recognized, valued. But now there alone in that damp bathroom, she felt as if she had been stupid for believing. He stayed there for hours, until the sound of the music died down, the children's footsteps moved away, and the silence of the orphanage returned. Then she took off the dress carefully, folded it as best she could, even with the tears, and put it back in the bottom of the box. But something inside her was different, as if a part had broken in a way that she still didn't know how to sew. That night, for the first time, Leah did not go to the mirror. He didn't want to see himself. He didn't want to smile. He lay down with his face turned to the wall and stayed that way until dawn. I was tired, not from work, not from seams, but from hope, of the desire to be seen. It was a different wound, not one that left marks on the body, but one that left holes where dreams once existed. And it was in that early morning, between fatigue and silence, that she made a promise to herself. He would never show his art to anyone again. He would never let them laugh at what he took so seriously again. If it were to sew, it would be alone, in secret, away from cruel eyes. Because he learned hard and early that not everyone understands the value of what is done with the heart. Still, Leah did not stop. I couldn't. The pain was real, but the impulse to create was stronger, even though she swore to keep everything. To herself, she continued to draw on pieces of cardboard and sew with scraps of thread. Not out of vanity, but because I no longer knew how to live without it. It was like breathing, and although she told herself that she no longer cared what others thought, something in her eyes changed. There was no more brilliance, just focus. She would, yes, but not to please, not to be accepted. I would sew to survive. And without knowing it, he began to build something that the world one day would not yet understand. But I couldn't ignore it. Leah had not been the same since the day her dress was torn. Something inside her had been definitively silent, as if the last attempt to trust others had been sewn with fragile thread, and when it broke, she took with her the courage to expose herself. She still sewed, but now she did it as someone who breathes in hiding, as someone who knows she can't live without, but is afraid of being seen doing it. He kept the scraps as if hiding a part of himself. Each lost bud was more precious than gold. Each piece of faded cloth was a blank canvas. Clothes are no longer a fantasy of acceptance. They became a way of venting, and over time they began to gain a new, deeper, more visceral strength. She stopped trying to make pretty clothes. Instead, he began to sew feelings. He picked up dark cloths when he felt angry, red lines when fear tightened. He mixed glaring colors on days when the silence hurt too much. Leah sewed what she felt, even without knowing how to name all those feelings. He did not make a sketch, nor did he follow a pattern. She sewed as if she were crying with her hands. The dresses she created had no symmetry. The seams were purposely crooked. The sleeves are sometimes uneven, but there was something in the plays that worried him. Something that seemed to contain, sewn inside, a mute scream, a poem without words, a story that begged to be heard. She began to hide everything under the bed, wrapped in old sheets. He was afraid that someone would find and destroy it again. But at the same time, there was a small part of him that hoped that someone one day would find out, as if art needed, at least once, to be looked at by someone who really understood. Not for beauty, but for truth. And it was this truth that Leah embroidered on every piece, like someone who writes letters that will never be sent, but that need to be written. Once he sewed an entire coat with greyish fabrics, all worn, stained, torn at the edges. In the center of the back, he applied a heart made of bright red fabric, coarsely cut with an apparent X-shaped seam on it. The piece was ugly, if seen through the eyes of the world, but anyone who looked closely would realize that that heart, sewn in the middle of the darkness, said everything she felt. It was the purest way he had to show himself, without showing his face. In the rare moments when he found old magazines thrown near the orphanage, he devoured the pages with photos of models and stylists. Not because of the pretty faces or expensive clothes, but because of the shapes, the colors, the cuts. I observed everything with the eyes of someone who learns in the eyes. I made molds with pieces of cardboard boxes. He used chalk from a blackboard to scratch the fabrics. She learned by herself to make folds, pleats, adjustments. There was no sewing machine. He used his fingers, strength, time, and even with the tips of his fingers always injured, he never stopped. Leah didn't need school to learn fashion. She learned from pain. As he grew older, his pieces also matured. The dresses began to gain layers. The clothes carried intentional contrasts, soft fabrics next to rough cloths, translucent tulle on thick linen, warm colors in shock with muted tones. It was as if each piece told a story, each reflecting a different state of mind. Leah was creating a language. Without knowing it, he was inventing a way to communicate what no words could handle. Each garment that came out of his hands was a translation of deep feelings. It was not fashion, it was an emotional alphabet. She knew she couldn't show that to anyone. She still carried the invisible scar from the day her dress was torn in front of everyone, and even after so long, it was enough to remember that collective laughter, to feel her stomach tighten. So he kept everything hidden, but the desire to be understood still lived inside her, even if muffled. It was a desire that was hidden in the silence of the days, in the long nights, in the solitary sighs, the desire that one day someone would see those pieces and say, "I understand." What Leah didn't know was that, little by little, her creations were going beyond the walls of the orphanage. Some employees had seen the drawings stored in boxes, and even without understanding what they saw, they began to comment. One of them, during a visit by the social worker responsible for the monthly reports, let slip that there was a strange girl who spent her days sewing meaningless clothes as if she lived in another world. I didn't say it out of malice. I said it because I didn't understand. But the comment was enough for one of the coordinators of social projects, interested in new forms of therapy with institutionalized children, to ask to see what Leah created. There was no invitation, no warning. They only came to her one afternoon, while she was sewing behind the laundry. He didn't have time to hide anything. She had a piece on her lap, a blouse made of old curtain cloths, sewn with zigzag threads of different colors, and with applications, of crumpled fabric that formed an unusual texture. When they realized what it was, they asked to see more. She hesitated, shook, but for some reason that even she couldn't explain, she obeyed. He took the box and handed it over. The woman leafed through the drawings, touched the fabrics, analyzed the cuts. I didn't say anything at the time. He just returned with a look that Leah didn't know how to interpret. It wasn't laughter, it was not contempt. It was something new, a different silence, and that stayed in her mind for days. I wonder what did. She see. Why didn't he laugh like the others? Why didn't he mock? Unbeknownst to her, some of those pieces would be taken for evaluation at an event that the assistant would participate in with other professionals in the area of child education and rehabilitation. They took as an example of symbolic expression of childhood trauma, a theoretical presentation without a name, without a face, but with images of some of Leah's clothes and drawings. And to everyone's surprise, there was interest. A group of alternative artists who worked with sustainable fashion and urban interventions contacted the assistant asking for permission to use those creations in an experimental exhibition on fashion and marginality. Everything is still informal, everything is small, almost invisible, but it was the first thread being pulled from a much larger fabric, and Leah still had no idea. Leah was already 16 years old when she overheard by chance a conversation that changed everything. It wasn't loud, nor said with malice. It was just another bureaucratic decision between two orphanage employees. She would soon be transferred to an adult shelter. She was at the age limit, and as she had not been adopted, the routine took its course. But to Leah, that word, shelter, sounded like a sentence. I knew what that meant. He knew that there, his silence would not be respected, that his clothes would be seen as a threat or madness, and that everything he had built in secret, all his small universe of threads, scraps, and drawings, would be swallowed by a place where the days passed without a soul. It was that same night, with her heart beating in her chest like a runaway drum, that she made the decision. He didn't think twice. She gathered the little she had, an old backpack, the most important drawings, 3 dresses that she considered part of herself, all wrapped carefully in sheets of newspaper, and the needle that never left her. He left through the back gate before dawn without making a sound, barefoot and fear packed together with hope. He didn't look back. The city was bigger than he remembered. The cold of dawn cut through the skin, and loneliness, which was once an internal place, now became geographical. She slept on the sidewalks, hidden between cardboard boxes, and used her backpack as a pillow. I was hungry almost always. Clean clothes, only when it rained, and you could take advantage of the water that ran down the gutters. But Leah still had something that no one could take away from her, her hands. They continued to work. Even with her fingers stiffened by the cold with tired eyes, she sewed. He picked up cloths wherever he found them, in hotel trash cans, in discarded boxes in laundries, even in bags left on the street. He cut with the rusty scissors he carried from the orphanage. He created improvised pieces and offered them to the few people who approached with kindness. It was not alms. It was an exchange. She sewed for mothers who needed to adjust their sons' clothes, for men who wanted to fix the hem of their pants, for ladies who wanted to turn an old scarf into a small bag. Every stitch, every line, was an attempt to stay alive, not just in her body, but in what made her who she was. It was on one of these mornings, while sitting on the sidewalk next to a grocery store, sewing the sleeve of an old blouse for a woman, in exchange for a piece of bread, that a different look fixed on her. An older man in elegant but discreet clothes stopped before the scene. He didn't say anything right away. He watched in silence. He had his hands crossed behind his back and his eyes attentive. When the woman thanked him and left, the man still stayed there. Leah noticed but did not react. He kept folding the fabrics, as if it were just one more morning among many. The man stepped forward, leaned slightly, and looked at his sewn blouse. Then he looked at the other scraps scattered next to the backpack. His eyes lingered on the dots, the color combinations, the overlapping textures. There was a look there of someone who understood what he saw, not with the haste of the curious, but with the reverence of someone who has lived surrounded by fabrics and shapes. He asked where it came from, who had taught her how to make pieces like that, and Leah, with a firm but low voice, answered without thinking too much. It was the pain. The answer made him change his stance. The man, named Marcel, was not just anyone. He had already been known in the past as one of the great names of European artisanal design. He had had a studio, had paraded in Milan, dressed celebrities, but a few years ago he had retired, disappointed by the coldness of the industry and the emptiness of trends. At that moment he was passing through, trying to find meaning in the art that had once fascinated him, and there, sitting on the floor, among the dirt and noises of the city, he found an anonymous artist sewing with more truth than any catwalk he had ever seen. There were no promises, contracts, or promises of the future. Marcel just reached out and offered help, a place to stay, food, a hot bath, and maybe, who knows, better lines. Leah hesitated, but accepted. For the first time, someone looked at her and what she was doing without laughing, without contempt, without pity. It was as if he was facing a chance he didn't know existed. And when she crossed the door of the small, disused studio where he lived, something inside her woke up. It was a dusty place, full of mannequins covered with sheets, old thread rolls of fabric leaning against the wall, machines standing still. But for Leah it felt like a sanctuary. She didn't know if she deserved to be there, but she knew she was ready to learn, or rather, ready to continue creating, only now, with light. Marcel didn't try to shape it. He understood from the beginning that Leah's talent was not technical. It was visceral. What she did not come from formulas, it came from memories. Her sewing was autobiographical. Each piece carried pieces of childhood, abandonment, resistance. He just guided, taught how to use the right instruments, how to name the stitches, how to recognize the fabrics. But he never interfered with the soul of the pieces. For weeks, Leah worked as if she were being reborn. She spent hours sewing in silence, now with materials she never imagined she had in her hands, fine lace, silks, pure linen. And even with all the novelty, it did not abandon its patches. He kept mixing the old with the new. She made a point of inserting pieces of fabric collected from the streets into her dresses as if she needed to remember where she came from. And when he saw the result, Marcel realized that he was not facing an apprentice. I was in front of someone who created his own language, a style that was impossible to reproduce. The pieces began to accumulate in the studio, each one more intense, more elaborate, more enigmatic. And as much as Marcel tried to describe what he saw, he always lacked words. It was as if Leah sewed not to dress bodies, but to touch stories. What she did had a soul, and for the first time he realized that he was witnessing the birth of something rare, not just an artist, but a force. She still didn't fully trust the world. He still recoiled when he heard footsteps. He still cringed at compliments. He still couldn't stand to hear loud laughter. But deep down, she began to believe that maybe her clothes didn't need to be hidden forever. And as the seams were aligned, day after day, a new possibility began to take shape, without her yet knowing how far she could go. The studio where Leah now lived was small, old, and full of silence. He had no luxury, no organization. It was more of a warehouse than a workshop, but to her it looked like a temple. The windows let in a dull light, and the smell of old wood mingled with the almost forgotten perfume of the fabrics that once dressed important people. On the walls, there were still molds scratched with charcoal, sketches hung with pins and clippings from fashion magazines from other decades. Everything there told stories that time no longer remembered, but that she felt when she touched. In the early days, Leah explored space as if walking through a sacred land. Each corner seemed to hide a possibility. He found rolls of fabric never used, threads of all colors, pieces of lace that seemed to float on his fingers, mother-of-pearl buttons that he would never have dared to touch in the orphanage. But what caught his attention the most was a forgotten box under the countertop. Inside there were remains, flour bags, old curtains, stained towels, floor cloths, things that seemed to have no value to anyone else. That made her smile. Those were his materials. It was with them that he had learned to dream. Marcel, with his usual calmness, watched unhurriedly. He showed tools, explained techniques, told backstage stories from the fashion world. But more than teaching, he realized that the best thing he could do was not to get in the way. Leah didn't need rules. He needed freedom. And that's what he gave her. A space without judgment, where it was not necessary to ask permission to create. There she could be who she was, without having to hide her ink-stained hands. The improvised drawings on the tiles, the molds cut out of cardboard boxes. In a short time, what was once an abandoned studio began to transform. The walls, once covered, in dust, came to life with hanging fabrics, pasted drawings, molds scattered as if they were part of the decoration. The floor, once rough, now served as a stage for extended pieces waiting for the last touches. The main table became an altar. Leah spent hours there, sewing in silence, with the concentration of someone who is writing something that does not yet exist. The pieces were not just clothes. They were living structures, full of meaning. Dish towels became dresses with layers. Burlap bags were transformed into coats with bold cuts. Old towels gained asymmetrical cutouts and the application of loose stones. Marcel every day saw himself more admired. I had already seen talent, of course. I'd already trained stylists. But what he saw in Leah was not just talent, it was true. A creative urgency, as if each piece was sewn not with commercial intent, but with existential need. She didn't create, out of vanity, she created because it was the only way to stay on her feet. He sewed like someone who breathes, like someone who screams without sound. One day, while cleaning one of the old shelves, Marcel found a forgotten camera, the kind he used in his fashion show days. He cleaned carefully, changed the batteries, and decided to record some of Leah's pieces. He set up an improvised background, used natural light, and asked her to just put the clothes on mannequins. The photos were not produced. No makeup, no tricks. Just fabric, light, and truth. And even so, the result was overwhelming. The clothes talked. It was possible to feel the weight of emotions in each image. The contrast between the simple material and the complexity of the cut created a strangeness that caught the eye. There was no way to ignore it. Marcel sent some of these photos to old friends in the fashion industry, people who had seen it all. But what happened next, even he didn't expect. One of the photos was reposted, uncredited, by a European influencer passionate about sustainable fashion. The image spread quickly through social networks. The piece, a dress made entirely of flour sacks with torn lace appliques and buttons, sewn with copper thread, was described as wild and poetic. People wanted to know who the artist was, who was behind that creation that seemed to mix pain, luxury, and denunciation in a single silhouette. The orders started to arrive. Invitations for interviews, participation in alternative fashion fairs, collaborative exhibitions. Everyone wanted to know the name behind the pieces. Marcel answered carefully, always preserving Leah's identity. She wasn't ready to show up yet. He preferred anonymity. He continued to wear simple clothes, keeping his hair tied up anyway and speaking little. When Marcel told her that her dresses were being shared by international designers, she just nodded. He did not ask for names, nor did he celebrate. He continued to sew. But even without looking for it, the world began to find her. A special invitation arrived from an independent gallery in Berlin. They wanted to exhibit 5 pieces as part of an exhibition on aesthetic reconstruction and affective memory. Marcel accepted on her behalf. They sent the clothes by safe transport, without any additional material, neither name nor biography. Just the clothes as she wanted. During the exhibition, fashion critics and artists passed by the pieces and wondered how anyone could transform such ordinary materials into such sophisticated structures. One of the dresses, made of patchwork, of yellow curtain with dark blue velvet bands, won praise from a German Vogue editor, who described it as memory sewn in silence. The artist's name, of course, was still a mystery, but the rumor began to grow. An anonymous young designer hiding somewhere in Europe was starting an artistic movement with clothes that told real and painful stories. Meanwhile, in the studio, Leah continued her routine. I sewed in the morning, drew in the afternoon, and in the evening I sat on the floor with my eyes fixed on new ideas. She still bore the features of the girl from the orphanage, but now there was something different in her eyes. A quiet confidence. It was not arrogance nor forced security. It was as if, for the first time, she had found a place where the world didn't have to be an enemy. And more than that, a place where her art was seen as art, not as delirium, not as an orphan's toy, not as repurposed garbage, but as a legitimate creation. The pieces continued to circulate. One of the dresses was worn by an alternative actress at an experimental film festival. Another appeared on the cover of an independent ethical fashion magazine. And all this happened without Leah having to go on stage, without saying a word, without even showing her face. Her clothes spoke for her, and they spoke loudly. Marcel knew the moment was approaching, the moment when anonymity would no longer be possible. The world was asking for her. People wanted to meet her, but he also knew that nothing in Leah could be rushed. She had lived for years being silenced, shamed, ignored, and now that she was being heard, she needed to learn to speak, not with words, but with presence. Inside the studio, there was one piece in particular that she never let anyone touch. It was the dress she had sewn at the age of 10, the same one they tore at the orphanage party. Leah had restored it little by little, sewing the original pieces together with new fabric, but keeping the old stitches, such as visible scars. It never allowed it to be used in any exhibition. He kept it like a reliquary, and it was this dress that, without anyone knowing yet, she was preparing for a much bigger moment. The news ran without warning, like a whisper that spreads until it becomes a scream. The world didn't know who she was, but it wanted to find out. One of the photos Marcel had taken weeks earlier, a close-up of a piece made of scraps of floor, cloth and details in worn lace, had been sent to an old acquaintance of his, someone with influence behind the scenes of Parisian fashion. It was a raw image, without filters, without retouching. Just fabric, light and pain sewn in silence. Marcel didn't expect much. Maybe a footnote mention. One more curiosity in the midst of the sea of futile novelties that the industry loved to feed. But something happened. The image fell into the right hands. An editor of a digital forum on alternative fashion reposted the piece with the caption, "I don't know who it is, but this outfit has a soul." In less than 24 hours, the post had been shared by dozens of specialized pages. Users wrote theories, looked for clues, expanded the image in search of any trace of the artist. They began to call her the invisible seamstress. That piece, made with what the world calls garbage, became a symbol of something much bigger. It was as if the dress revealed an entire story, without saying a single word. Independent fashion magazines focused on sustainability and artistic expression began mentioning the unknown name behind the creation. Of course, there was no name at all. Marcel protected Leah like a safe holds a valuable secret. She, in turn, remained oblivious to what was happening outside. He created every day with the same silent dedication, without imagining that his pieces were already being studied by critics and desired by collectors. At first, Marcel hesitated to tell, but little by little he had to share with her what was happening. When she heard that her clothes were being seen, Leah was silent. He didn't smile, nor was he scared. He just nodded, as if understanding that, sooner or later, what is true finds a crack to appear. But that didn't mean it was ready. The wound of childhood still breathed under the skin, the shame of being humiliated, the fear of being ridiculed again, the feeling of never being enough. Everything still lived there. The only difference was that now she had a place where those feelings could be turned into something concrete. It was in this context that the collection was born. It was not a collection in the classical sense. There was no seasonal theme, color chart, or concern with trends. It was a narrative sewn piece by piece. Leah called it Invisible Scars, a name that Marcel wrote by hand on a simple card to send to a curator in Berlin. Each dress in the collection was like a chapter in a book that only she could read. There was a grey dress made with pieces of school uniform knit, with red lines that crossed the chest like cut marks. Another, in beige, used parts of old bedspreads, sewn with large uneven stitches, purposely imperfect, as if the fabric had been spliced together in a hurry, like a heart that tries to keep beating even broken. One of the strongest dresses wore rust-stained tulle. The spots, although random, formed patterns that resembled hands. It was as if the fabric itself was screaming for help. On the bar, there were crumpled strips of tape with handwritten words, in children's handwriting. Each one represented a memory, fear, rain. It won't come back. Why? Leah never explained the meaning of each piece. He just delivered, as if offering a piece of himself, and let the world interpret it. Marcel sent the photos of the collection to a few names. Only people who knew how to see beyond the surface glow. In less than a week, the invitations began to arrive. Magazines asked for interviews. Galleries wanted to exhibit. Famous designers wanted partnerships. But none of them knew who Leah was. They did not know his age, his origin, or even his gender. The absence of a face became an identity. The signature, behind the scenes, was just an acronym drawn with a line, 3 dots intertwined like closed scars. It was the symbol of the collection. A point for trauma, a point for silence, and a point for transformation. Among the pieces, there was one in particular that caused the most commotion. It was a dress of undefined color, a grimy beige, mixed with faded shades of pink and blue, with hand-sewn rips with silver threads. It looked frail, almost falling off the hanger. But when you look closely, the structure was solid, resistant. The zipper was crooked but firm, the handles asymmetrical but secure. It was the rawest representation of what Leah was, someone who seemed about to collapse but who, inside, was made of steel. This dress became the cover of a digital conceptual fashion magazine. The headline was simple: The Luxury of Pain. The article talked about how trauma can be raw material for beauty, how imperfection, when accepted, generates something genuinely new. It wasn't just about fashion, it was about humanity. Marcel watched everything with a mixture of pride and fear. He knew that attention could be dangerous. The fashion industry is fast, insatiable, and often cruel, but he also knew that the world needed to see what Leah did. It was as if she translated universal emotions using forgotten fabrics, as if by sewing his own ghosts, he created bridges with the pains of others. Leah, in turn, kept the same pace. She didn't accelerate, she wasn't impressed. He knew that everything was temporary. I had seen too much to believe in promises, but he continued to create with more intensity. The collection grew. The pieces became bolder, denser. He began to experiment with new forms to incorporate unlikely materials: melted plastic, straw, shards of mirror embedded between layers of fabric. It was as if, being recognized without being seen, she felt freer than ever. Deep down, she was still the girl who sewed in secret. He still remembered the cracked mirror at the back of the orphanage. I could still hear the laughter, but now these sounds did not silence her. They were fuel. Every stitch, every fold, every aesthetic decision was a silent response to all the times she was told she had no value. The pain still lived in her, but now it had an address: the clothes. Meanwhile, the world kept trying to figure out who the anonymous artist was. Online groups created theories. Some said it was a collective of women survivors of the war. Others thought it was a performance artist pretending to be someone on the sidelines. There were those who claimed that everything was an invention of a marketing agency to sell sustainability. No one imagined that the creator of all that was a young woman who still slept on an old sofa in a makeshift studio, surrounded by memories that could not fit into words. Marcel continued to take care of everything, filtering the invitations, maintaining the balance between exposure and protection. But I felt that the moment was approaching. The world wanted more than clothes. He wanted to know who was behind it. I wanted a story, a face, a presence. And he read. Leah knew that. He no longer hid so much. He spent more time in front of the mirror, now clean and whole. He dressed his creations calmly, turned in front of the light, watched the fall of the fabric, the shadow of the cutouts, and in a special corner of the studio, a piece was waiting. The antique dress. The one that had been torn. The one who survived the shame, the contempt, the childhood. The same one she had sworn never to show again. But now restored with fragments of other pieces, with new layers, with golden dots on top of the old tears. It seemed to have a new purpose. She still didn't know when or how, but she felt that dress wouldn't be kept for long. He was the beginning, and perhaps it was also the end of a cycle. The cycle where fear made her hide, where trauma was a secret, where silence was refuge. And so, after Seam, she began to prepare. Not to be applauded, but to be seen entirely, without hiding the strands. The name first appeared as a subtle signature, embroidered in fine thread on the inside of a piece that circulated discreetly among editors. 3 letters separated by dots, almost imperceptible: L-I-A. No one knew exactly what it meant. Some thought it was a mysterious acronym. Others said it was a provocation, a faceless name like the artist herself. But it only took a sequence of leaked images, of clothes that seemed sculpted with raw emotion, for that brand to stop being just a curiosity and become an obsession. The invitation came with a quiet formality. Paris, the most awaited fashion event of the year. The week where the directions, tones, cuts of the next season, and sometimes of the next decade, are defined. It was the epicenter of everything, and among the great traditional houses, with their historic names and their collections planned a year in advance, the unknown name emerged. No one knew how that new brand, without an advertising campaign, without a famous designer, without a line of products for sale, had managed to get a space. But there it was, on the official schedule, with a scheduled time and location revealed, only the day before the parade. The chosen location was unconventional. No palaces, technological walkways, or historic theaters. It was an old textile factory, deactivated for decades, with peeling walls, exposed beams, and high windows through which the light entered without asking permission. The stained cement floor was not covered. The chairs were made of old wood, some with cracks, and in the center a single trail of light tore through the space, creating a line that divided darkness from expectation. When the first guests arrived, they found no posters, no merchandising, no soundtrack, just silence, a thick, almost unsettling silence. They sat slowly, whispering among themselves, trying to guess what they would see. There were fashion journalists, established stylists, influencers, artists, investors, everyone hoping to understand the mystery behind that brand that had appeared out of nowhere, and in a few weeks seemed to dominate all serious conversations in the medium. The lights did not go out completely. They only diminished, allowing the day outside to still have a voice through the old stained glass windows. And then, without warning, without music, without announcement, the first model emerged. There was no exaggerated makeup, no extravagant hairstyles. His face was clean, his walk serene. What caught his eye was his clothes, a long dress made of recycled fabric in shades of grey and mottled blue, with visible seams that crossed the body as if they were embroidered scars. The shoulders were uneven, the bar was irregular, and even then, or perhaps because of it, it was impossible to take my eyes away. The piece seemed to contain a whole story, a confession, an open wound. Others came, each one dressed as if carrying a chapter. Dresses made of ripped denim and antique tulle mixed with raw silk. Jackets assembled with reused leather straps and buttons different from each other. Skirts with layers of transparent fabric over faded floral print, as a childhood memory superimposed on pain. Each piece was unique, alive, and told something that could not be translated into words. The silence of the room persisted. No one dared to applaud, comment, or interrupt. It was as if everyone felt that they were facing something that demanded respect. The show was not just a fashion show, it was a sensory experience, a dive into memories that belonged not only to those who created, but to all those who have felt broken, ignored, sewn inside. In one of the most striking moments, a model appeared in a white dress dirty with paint, with childish handprints stamped around her waist. It was uncomfortable, painful, almost aggressive, and yet it was beautiful. Not a traditional beautiful. It was the kind of beauty that hurts, that makes those who look at it remember something forgotten. It was the kind of art that elicits silence because it does not fit into a superficial reaction. Among the guests, there were suppressed tears. A renowned fashion editor took off her sunglasses to wipe her eyes. A critic, known for his sarcasm, stood still, as if trying to process something that breaks all his references. And when the last model walked by, wearing a burlap coat with hand-embroidered words in different languages, all meaning return, the entire room was suspended. The lights remained low. No one entered. No designer appeared. No thanks were made. And then, almost imperceptibly, a movement. From the back of the shed, a lone figure began to walk along the side, slowly. His eyes took a long time to perceive her. She was small, thin, with her hair tied up simply. She wore a dress different from all of them, a dress made of patches, visibly antique, sewn with faded fabrics, buttons out of place and embroidered with gold thread. It was the dress, the same one who was once torn, humiliated, hidden, now restored, not with perfection, but with courage. Leah walked with the same silent steadfastness of someone who had spent her life hiding. Each step seemed to be sewn together with everything he experienced, and when he reached the center of the catwalk, he didn't smile, he didn't wave. It just stayed there, whole. For the first time in front of the world, the impact was immediate. There was something in that image that tore through the air. The audience, still silent, began to stand up, one by one, as if they were facing a revelation. She was not just a stylist, it was a whole story there, standing without disguises. The dress that once provoked laughter now caused reverence. The hands that sewed in secret now dictated a new standard of beauty. Leah didn't need to say anything. His body spoke. His presence filled the space like a silent cry for years. The commotion was real. Among those who stood up, there were those who clad with their hands and those who applauded with tears. Anna Wintour, sitting in the front row, took off her glasses, stared at the scene with teary eyes and just shook her head, as if recognizing the truth, even without understanding how she got there. The truth does not need to be explained. It needs to be felt. Leah remained there for a few seconds. Then she walked back the same way she had arrived, in silence, with steady eyes, carrying on her body a dress that had once been pain and was now redemption. The last light slowly went out. The room went dark. And there, in that pitch black full of emotion, no one had any doubts. Something new had begun. It was not a new fashion. It was a new language, and the signature was given. LIA. Legacy Identity Art. The silence still hung thick in the air even after the lights went out. It was as if the world was trying to breathe after seeing something that no longer fit within the expectations it carried. People were still standing, some motionless, others murmuring softly as if trying to understand what had just happened. The name, 3 letters sewn into everyone's memory, was now more than a brand. It was a symbol, an embroidered scar on the skin of the industry. LIA had become an event. And yet what no one expected was that the deepest moment of the night had not yet begun. The darkness remained for a few more moments. Time stretched as if the space itself bowed before the intensity of that parade, until a single light came. Ton! A narrow beam coming from above illuminated the end of the walkway, and there, standing in the light, Leah appeared. It was her anyway. But not as they expected, not glamorous, not wrapped in gold, not surrounded by security guards or production. She was alone. The dress she wore, at first glance, seemed out of place in the face of the aesthetic impact of the previous pieces. It was simple, sewn with scraps, spotty in some spots, changed buttons, the hem slightly crooked. A ribbon sewn on the shoulder with visibly thick thread, but for those who paid attention, it was easy to recognize. That piece was the dress, the first, the one that was torn up, torn, stepped on, the same one she sewed as a child, still with unsure hands and a chest full of hope. Now restored, reimagined, but without erasing its marks. She didn't hide it. He didn't reinvent it to make it look like something else. He kept the traces, the mistakes, the threads. He just added new layers, gold lines, discrete fabrics in strategic points. The soul of the piece remained intact, as if time had passed him by without asking permission, but with respect. Leah walked slowly to the center of the walkway. He stopped, under the light. She was barefoot, feet firmly on the cold ground, the serene face, the attentive eyes, the whole body saying that it was there, whole. It took a few seconds before someone noticed that she was holding a microphone. It was only when she brought the object to her mouth that the silence of the room became absolute. There was no soundtrack, no effects. Just the suppressed breath of hundreds of people waiting for something, maybe for everything. Her voice came out low, trembling, but decisive. She did not make elaborate speeches. He did not thank sponsors. He did not talk about trends, nor about the future. He said only what was necessary. She said that that dress was made in a cramped room, with leftover fabrics taken from the trash, sewn at night, hidden, because it was the only way to feel beautiful. He said they laughed, that they tore up, who mocked his courage, and that, for years she hid the piece as if it were a mistake. But now there in front of the world she wore it again, not out of nostalgia, but out of victory. The words did not need volume. Each syllable seemed sewn together with everything she had experienced. He said he never wanted fame, that the idea of being recognized was never part of her plans, that what she really wanted was to prove to herself that it was worth continuing to sew. That every stitch made in silence, every tissue recovered, every thread pulled with injured fingers had meaning, and that if an invisible, rejected, ignored child could turn his pain into something worthy of applause, then perhaps others could too. She didn't cry. Despite the emotion evident in the trembling of his voice, not a tear fell. His face carried the expression of someone who had been through everything, survived everything, and now he was finally where he belonged. She didn't smile out of vanity, nor out of relief. He smiled with dignity. It was the smile of someone who no longer needed to explain himself. The audience then reacted as if that moment had unlocked something collective. Applause broke the silence in an almost chaotic way. People crying, people shouting words of encouragement. In several languages, a disordered jubilation, almost clumsy but true. It was as if everyone knew right there at that moment that they were witnessing something rare. A story being told with the body, with the cloth, with time. A narrative that did not use words to seek impact, but seems to heal. Eyes have turned no longer to the brand nor to the collection. They turned to her, no longer as an enigma to be deciphered, but as someone who at last let himself be seen. And in that image, a thin, standing woman in a patched dress, there was more strength than in any luxury show Paris had ever seen. It was the reunion between past and present, between the invisible girl and the revered artist. And at that intersection of time sown without haste, something new was born. The dress that was once synonymous with shame was now valued at millions, but the value was not in the price. I was on the journey. It was the same cloth, the same line, the same girl, only now recognized by herself, sewn all over, still flawed, still scarred, but finally whole. And while the lights on the catwalk began to go out again, the audience remained standing. There were no more doubts. Leah's story could no longer be undone. She had become part of the very seam of the world. And to think that it all started with a piece of dirty cloth, it is a dream that no one wanted to hear. In the end, it wasn't about fame, nor about wealth. It was about turning pain into freedom, about giving voice to silence, forming the invisible, sewing what seemed impossible to fix. The dress was never sold because it was never made for the world. It was, and always would be, a message to herself. But it also ended up being a message to all of us, that even the most torn part of our history can be transformed into art. If this story touched you in any way, if you felt that you walked with Leah here, consider subscribing to the channel. We're always bringing you stories that don't scream, but that touch deep. And maybe you'll find more pieces of you here, and if you made it to the end, write in the comments. This message was for me. I'll know that you felt all this along, with me. Oh, and if you felt that it was worth the time, leave the like. This helps a lot to show that stories like this still make sense. There is a video here that tells a similar story, full of new beginnings and discoveries. Click and stay with me there. The next story is already waiting for you.